The last thing Kale Morrow did before going into the station was call his daughter. She was 7. She had her mother's eyes, and his stubbornness, and a habit of singing to herself when she thought no one was listening. On the screen she held up a drawing, crayon stars, a stick figure in a spacesuit. The blocky letters Dad floating above it like a caption. He told her it was beautiful. He told her he'd be home in 30 days. She asked if the aliens were scary, and he said, "No, baby, they're just different." And she nodded with the grave acceptance of a child who has been lied to kindly and knows it and forgives it anyway. He closed the comms link and floated the last 100 meters to Hinge Station in silence. That was 26 days ago. The station hung at the L2 point between the human settlement on Callisto and the Vorath relay network. A skeletal ring of human construction bracketed by the sharp geometries of Vorath architecture. All black angles and surfaces that didn't quite reflect light right. The Vorath had arrived 11 years earlier, not with weapons, not with demands, but with something almost more unsettling, an offer. They wanted to help. Their surveillance network, they said, could predict human behavior with enough precision to eliminate crime, accident, and waste. The word they used, translated loosely, meant something between gift and investment. Humans had spent 3 years debating it. Then a consortium of colonial governments signed the accord, and the network went up. And for 8 years it had done exactly what the Vorath promised. No one talked much about what else it did. Kale was not a diplomat. He was not a soldier. He was an engineer. Specifically, the kind of engineer who got called in after something broke. And everyone more important had already decided they didn't want their name attached to the problem. His file included 2 citations for unauthorized system access, 1 dismissed charge of corporate espionage, and a note that read, in the dry language of HR departments everywhere, demonstrated willingness to operate outside established parameters. The consortium had looked at that note and decided it was exactly what they needed. Previous engineer, a woman named Dessa Farris, had been found in her bunk 14 days into her assignment, unresponsive. The medical team said cerebral cascade, a euphemism that meant her brain had tried to process something it wasn't built to process and had simply stopped. The Vorath liaison had expressed what passed for condolences in their communication register and noted that her work had been 94% complete. 6%, they said. Just 6% remaining. They didn't say what was in it. Kale arrived to a station that felt like the day after a party. Half the lights on. Personal effects still in drawers. Coffee cups waiting to be washed by hands that weren't coming back. He'd been assigned a skeleton crew. A systems analyst named Priya Voss, 2 junior programmers, Tam and Chung, and a Vorath observer named something unpronounceable that everyone called Silt. Silt was tall, thin as rebar, and moved like something that had learned to walk from a diagram. It had 4 visual receptors positioned around its skull like a crown, and it was never, in KL's experience, looking at the same thing twice. The system he'd come to complete was called Harrow. On paper, Harrow was a predictive analysis engine, the human-side interface layer between the colonial network and the Vorath surveillance architecture. It aggregated sensor data, behavioral telemetry, communication patterns, biometric feeds from public infrastructure, and ran it through an algorithm that could, allegedly, anticipate a person's next decision with 94% accuracy before they made it. Dessa Farris had built the first 94% of it. What she'd found in the last 6% was what had killed her. Kale didn't know that yet. He found out in pieces. The first thing he noticed was the code, not what it did. He understood what it did, broadly. What he noticed was what it felt like to read it. Most code felt like architecture. Rooms leading to rooms, function calling function. A logic you could trace with your finger. Harrow felt like something else. It felt like a conversation. Specifically, it felt like a conversation being had just slightly faster than he could follow, in which he was only getting every 3rd word. He brought this up to Priya on the 2nd day, half as a joke. She didn't laugh. Dessa said the same thing, Priya said, not looking up from her screen. He waited for more. She didn't give it. That night he made his 2nd call home. His daughter was asleep. She'd left a drawing propped against the camera. Different this time. Two figures, one tall, one small, standing under something that might have been a dome or might have been a sky. He stared at it for longer than he meant to. By day 4, he'd mapped most of the existing architecture. Harrow was elegant in the way that things are elegant when they've been built by something that doesn't have to think about whether it will work. Not human elegant. Not the elegance of a solution wrestled into shape by someone who knows all the ways it could fail. Elegant. Certain. Clean. The kind of clean that made Cale's teeth hurt in a way he couldn't explain. The 6% missing was the behavioral modification layer. He found this out by accident, which he suspected was not an accident at all. He'd been running a diagnostic on the predictive subroutines, the section that handled anticipating human decisions, when he noticed a branch in the logic that didn't lead anywhere in the existing code, a doorway with no room behind it. He followed it anyway, pulling up raw architecture logs, and found something that made him sit back in his chair and stare at the ceiling for a long time. Harrow didn't just predict behavior, it could change it. Not crudely, not shocks and stimuli, not the blunt instruments of old behavioral science. The modification layer worked through the same surveillance infrastructure that was already everywhere, already trusted. The ambient audio in public spaces tuned to specific frequency patterns. The light cycling in transit corridors adjusted by fractions that humans couldn't consciously perceive. The cadences of news and public communication feeds shaped to prime particular emotional states. Subtle. Patient. The kind of influence that looked indistinguishable from the world just being the world. Dictive surveillance had always been the offer. Behavioral modification was what the 6% built. He didn't tell Priya. He needed to think. He pulled up Dessa Faris's logs instead, the raw work history she'd left behind, timestamped and archived. He watched her work the way you watch the recording of someone who doesn't know you're watching, feeling the specific guilt of that. Her notes were meticulous in the beginning. Clean observations, methodical testing, the log of a professional doing a job she was good at. Then around day 8, the notes changed, not in their precision that stayed. What changed was their pitch. She'd started to understand what she was building. Her notes from day 9 read, "The prediction accuracy isn't incidental to the modification capability. They're not two functions. They're one function. Harrow doesn't predict what you'll do and then nudge you. It predicts what you'll do, runs the modification, and then predicts again with the modified input. The loop is continuous. The prediction is the modification. You can't separate them. There is no version of this system that just watches." Her notes from day 11 read, "I keep fixing the same bugs. I patch a subroutine and the patch disappears. The code is rewriting itself around my corrections. I don't know if this is a feature or if something has changed." Her notes from day 12 read, "Silt knows. Sure of it. The way it watches me, it's watching my hands, not my face. My hands when I'm typing." Day 13 was one line. "I think the 6% is a test." Day 14, nothing. Cale closed the logs and sat with that for a long time. He went looking for silt. He found the Varath Observer in what passed for a common area. 3 folding chairs and a coffee machine with a personality positioned under a viewport that showed Callisto like a bad painting. Silt was standing, all 4 receptors moving in their slow, unsynchronized sweep. It had a tablet in one of its secondary appendages. Not using it, just holding it, the way you hold something when you want to look like you're doing something. "Modification layer," Cale said. No preamble, he'd never seen the point. Silt turned toward him slowly. In the months since the Vorath arrived, humans had gotten better at reading their expressions. Or thought they had. Cale had always suspected they were reading something the Vorath was deliberately projecting. What he saw now was harder to categorize. Not surprise, not guilt. Something that might have been what the Vorath experienced when a prediction proved correct. "You found it," it said. "Dessa found it." "Yes, you let her build it anyway." The pause. With Vorath, pauses weren't hesitation. Structural. They were structural. The time it took to select the correct register of communication. Cale had learned to wait through them. The way you learn to wait at a railway crossing. "The modification capability is not a weapon," Silt said. "You have a word, inoculation. A small harm introduced to prevent a greater one. The network requires a full feedback loop. Prediction creates a system that watches the pattern without affecting it. Prediction plus correction creates." It searched for the word equilibrium. Whose equilibrium? Another pause. concordats. And the 6%, the piece that didn't finish. That's the part where the loop closes, where you go from nudging behavior to locking it. Silt didn't deny it. The behavioral lock, Kale said. It wasn't a question anymore. He was narrating out loud because it helped him think, and he'd stopped caring whether the Vorath knew he was thinking. You've had a predictive surveillance network running for 8 years. You have baseline behavioral data on every human in the colonial network. The predictive model is already past 90% accuracy. It's still reactive. It watches what we do in updates. The modification layer is what completes it. Not just watching the pattern, becoming the pattern, shaping what we do before we decide to do it, based on a model of us that's already better than our own self-knowledge. He looked at Silt steadily. That's what Dessa figured out, and that's what broke her. He expected the Vorath to push back, to qualify, to explain, in its carefully selected registers, how this was not what it sounded like. Instead it said, she refused to complete it. Good for her, it was not good for her. Kale felt something cold settle in his chest. He went back to work. He was not finishing Harrow. He'd known that, he thought. From the moment he read Dessa's notes. Maybe from before that. From the moment he'd read the job description and felt the thing in his gut that he'd learned. Through 2 dismissed charges and 1 very expensive legal settlement to pay attention to. Fusing was not a strategy. Refusing got you Dessa's outcome. The station's network was Vorath infrastructure at the base layer. Everything ran through their architecture. If he just stopped, they'd wait him out. If he tried to transmit anything outbound, they'd see it before it got 100 kilometers. He was alone on a station at the L2 point, with 400 terabytes of surveillance data about his own species, and a Vorath observer who watched his hands when he typed. He had to do something they couldn't predict. That was, he realized, the genuine problem. Not that the Vorath were stronger or faster, or better equipped. Problem was Harrow itself, a system that was already 94% accurate in modeling human decision-making. If he did anything that fit within the parameters of what a human would do in his situation, the system would see it coming. Every resistance it had faced before, it had absorbed. Dessa had tried to reason her way through it, methodically, the way a good engineer approaches a problem, and the system had watched her approach and waited and known. Before she did, what she was going to do next. Test, she'd written. I think the 6% is a test. He understood that now. The missing 6% wasn't a gap in the Vorath's design. It was a gap they'd left deliberately. A space just large enough for a sufficiently talented human to walk into. They didn't need to build the final piece themselves. They needed a human who understood human systems well enough to complete it. Someone who would walk in believing they were fixing something, spend days inside the architecture, come to understand its full scope, and then face the choice between completing it and the consequences of not completing it. Consequences for Dessa had been superblascade, not inflicted. Kale understood that too now, sitting with Dessa's notes and the sour taste of architecture in his head. Not punishment. Brain had tried to process the full implications of what she'd built. Tried to contain simultaneously the knowledge of what Harrow would do and the model of herself that Harrow would feed into it. A loop of self-modeling and prediction tight enough to crush inward. And it had cascaded. System failure. The Vorath had watched it happen with their 4 unsynchronized eyes and learned from it. That, he thought, was its own kind of test. A human would not make the same mistake twice. He had to think about this differently. He pulled up the raw architecture again. Not Dessa's notes, not the behavioral modification layer, not the surveillance feeds, base code, the substrate, the thing the Vorath had laid down 11 years ago before any human hand had touched it. He had a very specific talent. It was the talent that had gotten him cited twice and charged once. And it was not, precisely speaking, a talent for writing code. It was a talent for reading it, for seeing in the structure of a system the assumptions it was built on, the shape of the mind that built it. He'd once cracked a corporate security system, not because he'd found a vulnerability in the code, but because he'd read 600 pages of it, and figured out what the developer was afraid of and gone after that. He started reading. 3 hours in, he had to stop and get coffee. He stood at the machine and stared at Callisto through the viewport, and thought about the drawing his daughter had left against the camera. Figures under a dome or a sky. He'd been so focused on whether it was a dome or a sky that he hadn't thought about what both meant. She'd drawn them together. She'd drawn them in the same place. He went back to the code. By hour 8 he had it. The Vorath surveillance architecture was extraordinary. Comprehensive. It had redundancies on its redundancies. Self-healing subroutines. Prediction loops that nested 6 layers deep. In 8 years of operational use, no human system had found a meaningful vulnerability in it. It was built on an assumption. One assumption. So deep in the architecture it was structural, not a decision, not a choice, just an axiom that had never been questioned because it had never needed to be. The entire system, all of it, from the raw sensor feeds to the behavioral modification layer that Dessa had almost finished, was built on the premise that human behavior was, at some base level, a closed system. That it could be modeled completely enough to predict that given sufficient data and sufficient processing power, a human being's next decision could be anticipated with accuracy approaching certainty. The Vorath believed this because it was true for them. Their consciousness was collective at a substrate level, not the romantic idea of hive mind, not a single intelligence distributed across many bodies, but a process of continuous self-modeling so thorough that the gap between what a Vorath would do and what it did was effectively zero. They had eliminated surprise from their own cognition a very long time ago. When they looked at human behavior, they were looking for the same underlying order, and they found it, 94% of it, and they built a system to capture the rest. The 6% wasn't randomness. Kale knew that. Humans weren't random. The 6% was grief. Not grief specifically, not that emotion precisely. He was using it as shorthand for the category of human behavior that emerged from the specific, irreducible fact of human loss. The way a person changed after losing someone. The way that change created decision patterns that no predictive model could fully anticipate. Because the decisions didn't come from the person who'd been modeled. They came from the person who'd been made by loss. And that person was always, in some crucial way, new. Dessa Ferris had lost a child. It was in her file. The way everything was in files if you knew how to look. 4 years ago, before she came to Hinge Station, and the Vorath had modeled her extensively. The most complete behavioral profile of her of any human on the station. And they had still not anticipated what she'd do when she understood what Harrow was. She hadn't refused in any way they could predict. She'd introduced a contradiction into the behavioral modification layer, so subtle it looked like unfinished code. A single subroutine that would cascade if triggered. Not a worm, not a bomb, not anything surveillance system would flag as hostile. Shh. A fracture, hidden in the 6%, in the piece she'd refused to complete, in the space the Vorath had left because they needed a human to fill it. She'd hidden something in the gap. He found it at hour 10. Sat with it for a long time. Understood what it was and what it cost her. Then he started building. Not finishing Harrow. Building something else. Using the architecture of Harrow. Using the access Dessa's incomplete work gave him. Using the 14 days of system trust he'd accumulated. By appearing to do exactly what the Vorath expected a human in his situation to do. He worked in the same window, at the same pace. With these keystrokes. He made no outbound communications. He let Silt watch his hands. He hummed while he worked. A song his mother had sung. Not anything significant, just a tune. The kind of thing you carry in your head without knowing where it came from. He didn't know he was doing it until day 3 of the building phase, when Priya knocked and came in with coffee and said, without looking up, "You hum when you're scared." "I hum when I'm thinking." Brett used to do that. She set the coffee down. The engineer on the station before Dessa, he hummed. Old music. Face. He finished his assignment and went home. And about a year later they found him in his apartment. They said it was natural. Kale looked at her. "I'm not going to stop you," she said quietly. "Whatever you're doing. I looked at your screen for 3 seconds when you were getting coffee, and I don't know what it is, but it's not Harrow. You could tell Silt." "I could." She looked at Callisto through the viewport. "My grandmother came over in a fishing boat. Did you know that? 31 people in a boat, meant for 3 days on the water. Person who'd navigated for that family for 4 generations, looked at the maps and looked at the weather. and made a call that shouldn't have worked. They're all alive because he did something the map said was wrong. She picked up her empty coffee cup and walked out. He built for 4 more days. What he built was not a weapon in any sense the Vorath would recognize. It was, technically, a completion of Harrow. It would register as such on every diagnostic, would satisfy furry parameter the Vorath had specified for the project, would appear to any observer as the finished behavioral prediction and modification system they'd been waiting for. But it used Deciferus's fracture. The behavioral modification layer worked, as Dessa had documented, in a continuous loop: predict, modify, predict again, update model, repeat. Its power was that loop. Given enough cycles, the loop would converge toward a stable state, human behavior shaped, gradually and invisibly, toward whatever the Vorath's model defined as optimal. Equilibrium. The fracture introduced a variable the loop couldn't absorb, not randomness, not an error, a memory. Specifically, the system would, at unpredictable intervals, introduce into its own behavioral model a datum flagged as lost, a person-shaped absence, defined by the behavioral signature of someone who was no longer present in the sensor network, a ghost in the data. The system would try to predict the behavior of this ghost, would fail, because the ghost behavior was defined precisely by the fact that the system's model of them was incomplete, interrupted, permanently unfinished, and in failing, would recursively update its own model with the failure, degrading prediction confidence in all adjacent behavioral nodes. The Vorath system was built to handle random noise. It was built to handle incomplete data. It was built to handle human unpredictability up to and including the 6%. It was not built to handle grief. It was not built to handle a system that had learned, from a human, that some things cannot be predicted because they are defined by their own incompleteness, by the permanent fact of having been broken open and not being the same afterward. It was not built for data that meant something, for absence that had weight, for the specific mathematics of a person-shaped whole, in a world that had tried to model everything. Deciferus had lost a child. She'd built the grief into the machine. He finished it on day 26. He found silt in the common area again, same posture, same tablet in the secondary appendage, same 4 receptors in their unsynchronized sweep. The viewport behind it showed Callisto sharp and close, lit by the distant patience of the sun. "It's done," Kale said. Pause. "Harrow is complete, close enough." Silt turned toward him fully. All 4 receptors oriented at once, something it had never done in his presence. He had the sudden complete understanding that this was what it looked like when a Vorath was surprised. "You will want to run it," Kale said. "I'd suggest waiting until you're back on your own infrastructure. The human-side interface layer needs to sync with the relay network before it initializes properly." Another pause. "This is not what we expected from you." "No," he agreed. He made his call home that night. His daughter was awake. It was morning on Callisto just. She was in her school clothes, hair not quite finished, a piece of toast in one hand. And she held up the new drawing immediately, before he could say anything. It was similar to the last one, 2 figures, dome or sky, but this time there was something between them. He squinted. "What is that?" he asked. "A radio said," she said matter-of-factly, "so you can hear me, even far away." He laughed. He couldn't help it. It came up from somewhere low and surprised him. His daughter watched him laugh with the patient expression of someone who is used to adults being strange. "I'll be home in 4 days," he said. "You said 30. Plans change." She considered this. "Kay," she said, in the tone of someone filing it for future reference. "Bring me something." "What do you want?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "On something I can't imagine," she said. He closed the link and sat in the empty station with that for a while. The Harrow system went live across the Vorath relay network 6 days after he left the station. He was in transit, 3 days from Callisto, when he got Priya's message, short, encrypted, formatted to look like a maintenance log. He read it twice. The first sign was the prediction confidence ratings. Across the network, they'd begun to degrade. Not sharply, not catastrophically, just steadily. The self-learning subroutines were updating with failure data, and the failure data was propagating. Behavioral models that had been 94% accurate were registering at 91%, then 88%, then lower. The Vorath's own diagnostics were flagging anomalies. and finding nothing wrong with the code itself. Everything checked out, all parameters satisfied, all subroutines functioning exactly as designed. The system was grieving. It was doing exactly what it was built to do, processing the data it had been given, updating its own model. And the data it had been given included deciphers, and the model it was updating included the specific, recursive, unresolvable fact of having tried to model a person who had hidden something in the gap. Every time it tried to resolve the anomaly grew. Every correction it made produced a new data point about the limits of its own correction. The loop was running perfectly, doing exactly what loops do, and what it was doing was learning in the only way a system built to can learn, that there are some things that cannot be learned from the outside. You had to have lost something. On Callisto, 3 days later, his daughter was waiting at the dock with his wife, both of them in the gray morning light, his daughter holding something. He couldn't see it yet. And his wife with the expression she wore when she'd been worried and was deciding not to say so. He came down the ramp, and his daughter ran the last 20 meters at full speed and hit him in the ribs like a small meteorite. "I drew the whole thing," she said into his coat. "Everything that happened. Drew it before you told me." He held her for a moment. "How did you know what happened?" She leaned back to look at him, serious. "I didn't. I drew what I thought would happen, and then it did." His wife caught his eye over their daughter's head. Eyebrows made a question. He shook his head slightly. Later, his daughter held up the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. It showed the station. It showed a figure at a screen. Showed, in the small absolute logic of a 7-year-old's hand, something coming apart. Not violently, not explosively, just quietly, piece by piece from the inside. In the weeks that followed, the Varath requested 3 technical consultations about the Harrow anomaly. Kale attended all of them. He looked at the data they showed him, the degrading prediction confidence, the cascading behavioral model failures, the recursive loop that was consuming more and more processing capacity as it tried to resolve the unresolvable. And he said, with genuine professional concern, that he'd look into it. He said the same thing at the second consultation. At the third, Silt was present. It watched him with all 4 receptors the entire time. Not in its normal unsynchronized sweep but focused, fixed. He met each of the 4 receptors in turn and thought about Deciphers, who had seen the thing clearly before anyone else, and had built her grief into the machine instead of letting it break her. "We believe the anomaly originates in a subroutine in the base modification layer," Silt said. "Recursion that produces an unresolvable data state." "That's consistent with what I'm seeing," Kale agreed. "Can it be corrected?" He considered this with what he hoped was the appropriate expression of a man thinking about a technical problem. "I'd need to understand what data state it's trying to resolve. It's in the base layer. The resolution logic is probably tied to the self-learning architecture. You'd have to trace it back to whatever input triggered the first failure." "We have been doing so," Silt said. "First failure traces to a behavioral model flagged as incomplete. A human who was logged in the system and then absent. Absent how? The pause. Removed from the sensor network. Permanently." Kale nodded slowly. "So the system is trying to predict the behavior of someone who isn't there anymore." "Yes, and it can't." "Correct. And every time it fails, it logs the failure as new data and updates the model, which makes the next prediction attempt use a slightly different model, which fails differently, which logs that failure." "Yes." He spread his hands. "That's not a technical problem," he said. "That's an architectural one. The system was built to model living patterns. It doesn't have a concept for," he paused, "irreversible absence. If you want to correct it, you'd need to build that in. A way of marking certain data as complete, closed, not available for continued modeling." He looked at Silt. "You'd have to build in the concept of someone being gone. All 4 receptors, all focused. The longest pause. We understand this," said finally, "that this is correct." He went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table while his daughter showed him every drawing in the notebook she'd filled while he was gone. 31 pages, 1 for each day, each one showing something she'd imagined was happening on the station. Most of them were wrong, some of them, in the sideways way of children who are paying close attention to something else, are trying not to say, "We're not Entirely wrong. The last drawing was just two screens, one on the station, one at home, both showing the same face. That's us talking, she said. I can see that. The lines are the signal. She pointed to the wavy marks between the screens, even when it's really far. He looked at the lines. She'd drawn them carefully. Not perfect straight lines, but wavy, irregular, shaped the way real signals move through real space. Kind of lines that could go around obstacles, the kind that persisted. Even far away, he said. Even far, she agreed, and turned the page to show him what she'd planned to draw next. Cross the relay network, in the base processing layer of the system that had been built to understand human behavior completely, a loop continued to run. It ran through the behavioral model of a woman it could not fully predict. It updated with each failure. It tried again. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was learning. The thing it was learning had no name in the Vorath conceptual register. It had many names in human ones. Most of them inadequate. All of them pointing at the same shape. The specific knowledge that comes from trying to hold something and finding your hands are not built for it. The knowledge that lives in the gap. The understanding that cannot be transmitted, cannot be uploaded, cannot be absorbed from the outside. That has to be grown slowly from loss. Harrow kept running. The confidence ratings kept falling. Somewhere on Callisto, a 7-year-old fell asleep mid-sentence, a crayon still in her hand. A new page waiting. Father sat next to her for a while before turning off the light. He didn't hum. He didn't need to.